Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and felt like the person staring back at you was a complete stranger? Like somewhere along the way, between the morning coffees and the endless to-do lists, you lost pieces of yourself you didn't even know were missing? That's exactly how Sarah Mitchell felt on that cold December morning in Minneapolis, just 3 days before her 47th birthday. She had everything society told her she should want: a beautiful colonial home in the suburbs, 2 kids in college, a husband who still brought her flowers every Friday, and a successful career as a marketing director at a Fortune 500 company. Yet standing there in her walk-in closet, surrounded by designer clothes and shoes she barely wore, Sarah felt emptier than she'd ever felt in her entire life. The house was quiet that morning, too quiet. Her husband David had left early for his business trip to Seattle, and the silence seemed to echo through every room, bouncing off the family photos that lined the hallways like a museum of a life she wasn't sure belonged to her anymore. She picked up a silver frame from her dresser, studying the smiling faces from their last family vacation in Cabo. Everyone looked so happy, so perfect. But Sarah remembered that day differently. She remembered the forced smile, the way she'd had 3 glasses of wine before noon just to get through the photo session, the argument with David afterward about her drinking that had ended with them sleeping in separate beds. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When she was younger, Sarah had dreams that stretched beyond the suburbs. She'd wanted to be a writer, to travel the world, to make a difference. Instead, she'd followed the path that everyone expected: college, marriage, kids, career. And now, at 47, she felt like she was suffocating under the weight of a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow within. The truth was, Sarah had been feeling this way for months, maybe even years, but she'd pushed it down, buried it under work deadlines and soccer games and dinner parties, where she played the role of the happy suburban wife so well that sometimes she almost believed it herself. That morning was different, though. That morning, something inside her finally cracked. Maybe it was the email she'd received the night before from her college roommate Emma, now living in Portugal and running a small art gallery, talking about her morning walks along the coast and the freedom she'd found in starting over. Or maybe it was the conversation she'd overheard at Starbucks the day before. 2 women discussing a friend who'd left everything behind to find herself. Whatever it was, Sarah knew she couldn't keep living like this. She called in sick to work, something she hadn't done in 5 years, unless she was genuinely ill. Her assistant, Jennifer, sounded concerned on the phone, asked if everything was all right. Sarah assured her it was just a migraine, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. After hanging up, she sat on the edge of her bed and did something she hadn't done in years. She cried. Not the pretty tears of sadness you see in movies, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal, somewhere real. When the tears finally stopped, Sarah felt strangely lighter. She walked downstairs to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat at the breakfast nook where she'd served thousands of meals over the years. The December sun was trying to break through the gray Minnesota clouds, casting weak shadows across the granite countertops. She thought about all the mornings she'd rushed through this space, barely tasting her coffee, always focused on the next thing, the next meeting, the next obligation. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Landed safely! Meeting with clients at 2. Love you!" She stared at the words, waiting to feel something, anything. But there was just numbness. When had love you become just words, a habit rather than a feeling? She couldn't remember the last time they'd really talked, really connected. Their conversations had become transactions. Who's picking up the dry cleaning? Did you pay the mortgage? What time is dinner with the Johnsons? Sarah's mind drifted to her daughter Ashley, now a junior at Northwestern studying pre-med. Ashley had called last week, stressed about her MCAT prep and organic chemistry grades. Sarah had given her the usual pep talk about persistence and hard work, but afterward, she'd wondered if she was just passing on the same pressure to achieve that had led her to this moment of crisis. And her son Michael, a freshman at Colorado State, seemed happy enough, but their conversations rarely went deeper than his need for money or updates about his fraternity. She thought about calling her mother in Phoenix, but quickly dismissed the idea. Eleanor Wilson was a force of nature at 72, still playing tennis 3 times a week and volunteering at the hospital. She wouldn't understand. To her generation, you didn't question happiness if you had a roof over your head and food on the table. You certainly didn't have existential crises at 47 when you had everything you were supposed to want. Instead, Sarah found herself scrolling through her phone, looking at the social media feeds of people she hadn't talked to in years. Everyone seemed so happy, so fulfilled. Beach vacations and promotion announcements and anniversary dinners. She knew it was all curated, all filtered, but it still made her feel like she was the only one struggling, the only one who'd lost her way. That's when she saw it. A post from her high school friend Maria, someone she hadn't spoken to in probably 15 years. Maria had shared an article about women reinventing themselves in midlife, about finding purpose beyond the roles of wife and mother. Sarah clicked on it, reading hungrily about women who'd left corporate jobs to start nonprofits, who'd divorced after decades of marriage to find themselves, who'd moved across the world to chase dreams they'd put on hold. One story in particular caught her attention. A woman named Rebecca from Connecticut, who'd left her job as a bank executive at 50 to become a grief counselor after losing her sister to cancer. Rebecca talked about how the loss had awakened something in her, made her realize she'd been sleepwalking through life. "I realized I had a choice," Rebecca was quoted as saying. "I could keep living the life everyone expected me to live, or I could honor my sister's memory by actually living." Sarah read the sentence 3 times, feeling something stir inside her chest. When was the last time she'd felt truly alive? Not just busy or productive or successful, but alive. She tried to remember but came up empty. Even the things that used to bring her joy, reading, hiking, painting, had fallen by the wayside, replaced by obligations and responsibilities. She stood up abruptly, startling the cat, who'd been sleeping on the kitchen windowsill. Oliver, a fat orange tabby they'd adopted 5 years ago, gave her an indignant look before settling back down. Even the cat had his routine, his comfortable existence. Everyone in this house did except her. Sarah climbed the stairs to the attic, a space they rarely used except for storing Christmas decorations and old kids' toys. But she knew what she was looking for. In the far corner, behind boxes labeled Halloween and Easter, she found it. A dusty cardboard box with Sarah's things written in faded marker. She hadn't opened it in at least 10 years. Inside were relics from another life. Her journals from college, filled with poetry and dreams and plans for the future. Photos from her semester abroad in Florence, where she'd felt more like herself than ever before or since. The half-finished manuscript of a novel she'd started in her 20s, about a woman who discovers she can hear the thoughts of trees. She'd thought it was silly at the time, had let David convince her that she should focus on more practical pursuits. But holding those pages now, reading her younger self's words, she felt a pang of loss so acute it took her breath away. There was also a letter she'd written to herself at 25, part of some self-help exercise a therapist had suggested after her father's death. "Dear future Sarah," it began, "I hope you're living boldly. I hope you're writing every day. I hope you haven't settled for safe when your heart wants wild. I hope you remember that Dad always said life is too short to live someone else's dream." Sarah sank to the attic floor, surrounded by the artifacts of a person she used to be. Her father had died of a heart attack at 55, just 8 years older than she was now. She'd been devastated, had promised herself she'd live fully in his honor. But somehow, that promise had gotten lost in mortgages and promotions, and the daily grind of suburban life. Her phone rang, jarring her back to the present. It was her boss, Richard, probably wondering why she wasn't on the morning conference call. She let it go to voicemail. Then came a text from her friend Linda about the upcoming book club meeting. "We're reading another thriller, Wine and Gossip at my place Thursday." Sarah stared at the message. She couldn't remember the last time their book club had actually discussed a book. It had become just another social obligation, another place to perform happiness. She spent the rest of the morning in the attic, going through old photos and letters. There was one from Emma, written after their college graduation, talking about their plans to backpack through Europe and write a book together. They'd been so sure they'd stay close, stay true to their dreams. But life had pulled them in different directions. Emma had actually done it, though. Moved to Europe, pursued art, created a life that was authentically hers. By noon, Sarah had made a decision. Not a big dramatic one, not yet, but a small one that felt monumental. She was going to take a trip, alone. She'd never traveled alone, not once in her 47 years. David always planned their vacations, cruises and resorts, in safe, predictable destinations. But she wanted something different. She wanted to go somewhere that would shake her awake. She went back downstairs and opened her laptop, her heart racing like she was doing something illicit. Where to go? Paris felt too cliché, Bali too trendy. Then she remembered something. In college, she'd written a paper on Georgia O'Keeffe about how the artist had found herself in the desert of New Mexico. She'd been fascinated by the idea of a landscape that could transform you, that could strip away everything false and leave only what was essential. Before she could lose her nerve, Sarah booked a flight to Santa Fe for the following week. A small bed and breakfast outside the city. A rental car. 5 days to herself. She felt giddy and terrified in equal measure. What would she tell David? The kids? Her boss? The house phone rang. Yes, they still had one. David insisted on it. And she saw it was her neighbor, Patrice, easy, probably calling about the homeowners association meeting or the holiday cookie exchange. Sarah let it ring. She was tired of cookie exchanges and association meetings and all the small ways she'd let her life become smaller and smaller. She thought about her friend Carol from book club, who'd confided after too much wine last month that she'd been on antidepressants for 3 years. It's just easier, Carol had said. Take a pill and you can keep going through the motions. Sarah had nodded sympathetically, but inside she'd felt a chill of recognition. How many of them were just going through the motions? That afternoon, Sarah did something else she hadn't done in years. She went for a walk. Not a power walk with her fitness tracker and podcast about productivity, but a real walk. She wandered through her neighborhood as if seeing it for the first time. The identical houses with their manicured lawns, the SUVs in every driveway, the fake deer statues and seasonal wreaths. When had this become her whole world? She found herself at the small park at the end of the subdivision, where she used to take Ashley and Michael when they were young. The playground was empty on this cold December day, the swings moving slightly in the wind. Sarah sat on one of them, not caring if anyone saw her, a middle-aged woman alone on a swing set. She thought about her grandmother, Rose, who died when Sarah was 16. Rose had been a firecracker of a woman who'd raised 6 kids mostly on her own after her husband left. She'd worked in a factory, never had much money, but she'd had a spark, a joy for life that Sarah remembered vividly. Don't you ever apologize for wanting more, Rose had told her once. Life's too short to play small. But somewhere along the way, Sarah had done exactly that. She'd played small, played safe, played the role everyone expected. The good wife, the devoted mother, the successful professional. And in playing all those roles, she'd lost track of who she actually was underneath it all. Her phone buzzed with an email from Jennifer, forwarding the notes from the meeting she'd missed. Quarterly projections and market analyses and strategic initiatives. Sarah deleted it without reading. What was the point of climbing the corporate ladder if you didn't even know where it led anymore? As the sun began to set, painting the Minnesota sky in shades of pink and orange, Sarah walked back home. The house looked different somehow, like she was seeing it through a stranger's eyes. All that space, all those rooms filled with things they didn't need. The 3-car garage, the professional landscaping, the life they'd built that felt more like a prison than a home. Inside, she made herself a simple dinner. Scrambled eggs and toast, comfort food from childhood. She ate slowly, actually tasting the food. When was the last time she'd eaten a meal without multitasking, without scrolling through her phone or reviewing documents? That evening, David called from Seattle. He talked about the client meeting, the weather, the hotel restaurant. Sarah made appropriate responses, but her mind was on the flight she'd booked, the secret burning inside her. When he asked about her day, she said it had been quiet. Not a lie, exactly, but not the truth either. After they hung up, Sarah felt the weight of all the conversations they didn't have, the dreams they never discussed, the questions they never asked each other anymore. When had they stopped being curious about each other's inner lives? When had they settled for this comfortable distance? She thought about her parents' marriage, how her mother had sublimated all her own desires to support her father's career. After he died, her mother had confessed that she'd wanted to be a teacher, but had given it up when Sarah was born. That's what you did back then, she'd said. but Sarah had heard the regret underneath the words. Was she repeating the same pattern? Not exactly. She had her own career, her own success, but in a way, it was worse. She'd checked all the boxes, done everything right, and still ended up feeling empty. At least her mother could blame societal expectations. What was Sarah's excuse? That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with possibilities and fears. What if she went to Santa Fe and nothing changed? What if she was just having a midlife crisis, a cliché of a suburban woman looking for meaning? But what if she didn't go? What if she just kept living this half-life, sleepwalking through her days until it was too late? At 3 in the morning, she got up and went to the guest room, not wanting to wake David when he returned the next day to find her still awake. She sat by the window, watching the snow begin to fall, covering the familiar landscape in white. It felt like a sign somehow, like the universe offering her a blank slate. Sarah thought about all the women she knew who were struggling with similar feelings. Her colleague Janet, who'd confided that she cried in her car every morning before work. Her sister-in-law Patricia, who'd started drinking a bottle of wine every night to cope with the loneliness of an empty nest. Her childhood friend Donna, who'd had an affair with her personal trainer, desperate to feel desired again. They were all looking for something: meaning, purpose, passion, connection. But they were looking in the wrong places, trying to fill the emptiness with affairs or alcohol or antidepressants. Sarah didn't want band-aids. She wanted surgery. She wanted to cut away everything that wasn't essential and see what remained. The next morning, she called in sick again. Jennifer sounded more concerned this time, mentioned that Richard was asking questions. Sarah promised she'd be back the following day, though even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. How could she go back to pretending everything was fine? She spent the day preparing for her trip, but it felt like preparing for more than that. She bought a new journal, the first one in years. She went to the library and checked out books about Santa Fe, about Georgia O'Keeffe, about women who'd reinvented their lives. She felt like a teenager sneaking around, hiding evidence of her plans. That afternoon, she drove to the art supply store she used to frequent before life got too busy for painting. The smell of oil paint and turpentine brought tears to her eyes. How had she let this part of herself die? She bought a small travel set of watercolors and a sketch pad, feeling reckless and alive. On the way home, she stopped at the cafe where she used to write in her 20s. It had changed ownership twice since then, was now a trendy spot with exposed brick and overpriced lattes. But sitting in what used to be her corner booth, Sarah could almost feel the ghost of her younger self, the woman who believed she could write novels and change the world. A young woman at the next table was typing furiously on her laptop, completely absorbed in her work. Sarah wanted to lean over and tell her not to give up, not to let life pull her away from whatever dream she was chasing. But she knew how that would sound, like the bitter warnings of a middle-aged woman who'd lost her way. Instead, she opened her new journal and began to write. Not the novel she'd abandoned, not poetry, just thoughts. Raw, honest thoughts about who she'd become and who she wanted to be. The words flowed like water from a broken dam, 20 years of suppressed feelings spilling onto the page. I don't recognize myself anymore, she wrote. I look in the mirror and see a stranger wearing my face. When did I become this person who schedules her life in 15-minute increments? Who measures success by salary and square footage? Who forgot how to dream? A text from Linda interrupted her writing. Don't forget book club Thursday. We need to finalize the holiday party plans. Sarah stared at the message, then did something she'd never done before. She typed back, I won't be able to make it. Actually, I'm taking a break from book club for a while. The response was immediate. Is everything okay? Did something happen? Sarah could imagine the gossip already starting, the speculation about whether she and David were having problems, whether she was having some kind of breakdown. Let them talk, she thought. Their opinions had controlled too much of her life already. That evening, Ashley called from Northwestern. She was stressed about an upcoming exam, worried about maintaining her GPA for med school applications. Sarah found herself asking a question she'd never asked before. Honey, do you actually want to be a doctor? Or is it what you think you should want? There was silence on the other end. Then Ashley said, Mom, are you okay? You sound weird. I'm fine, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. I just want to make sure you're choosing your own path, not the one you think will make everyone else happy. Of course I want to be a doctor, Ashley said, but there was something in her voice, an uncertainty that Sarah recognized. Had she passed on her own disease of people-pleasing to her daughter? After they hung up, Sarah sat with the uncomfortable realization that her unhappiness hadn't existed in a vacuum. It had rippled out, affecting everyone around her. The fake smiles, the surface conversations, the constant striving for external validation. She'd modeled all of it for her children. She thought about Michael, how he'd chosen Colorado State partly to get away from the pressure he felt at home. He'd told her once, after a few beers last Christmas, that he felt like nothing he did was ever good enough. She'd assured him that wasn't true, but wasn't it? Hadn't she spent years pushing both kids to excel, to achieve, to check all the same boxes she had? The next day was Wednesday, and Sarah forced herself to go to work. She sat through meetings, nodded at presentations, responded to emails, but it all felt surreal, like she was watching herself from above. How many days had she spent like this, going through the motions, contributing to profits she didn't care about for a company that would replace her within a week if she dropped dead? During lunch, she sat in her car and called Emma in Portugal. It was evening there, and Emma sounded relaxed, happy. They hadn't talked in months, but Emma didn't seem surprised to hear from her. I've been thinking about you, Emma said. Had a dream about our old apartment, that terrible couch we found on the street. The orange one that smelled like cats? That's the one. They both laughed, and for a moment, Sarah felt 22 again. Can I ask you something? Do you ever regret it? Leaving everything behind? There was a pause. Honestly, the only thing I regret is not doing it sooner. Sarah, what's going on? And so Sarah told her. About the emptiness, the trip to Santa Fe, the feeling that she was suffocating in her own life. Emma listened without judgment, making small sounds of understanding. You know what I remember most about you from college? Emma said finally. You had this light, this passion for everything. You made me believe I could be an artist because you believed it so fiercely. When did you stop believing in yourself? Sarah couldn't answer because she was crying again, sitting in her car in the company parking lot, 20 years of friendship compressed into this moment of truth. Come to Portugal, Emma said suddenly. After Santa Fe, come see me. Let me remind you who you are. The offer hung between them, impossible and tempting. I can't just leave everything. Can't you? Sarah, you're 47, not 97. You have so much life left. Don't waste it being someone you're not. After they hung up, Sarah sat in her car until the windows fogged up. She thought about the woman in the article, Rebecca, who'd said she could either keep living the life everyone expected or actually start living. The choice seemed so clear when someone else made it. That afternoon, Richard called her into his office. He was concerned about her absences, her lack of focus. You're one of our top performers, Sarah. But lately, it seems like you're checked out. Is there something going on I should know about? She looked at him, 55, divorced twice, in the office 12 hours a day, and wondered if he ever questioned his choices. Richard, are you happy? He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What does that have to do with anything? I'm just curious. You've achieved everything. Corner office, 6-figure bonuses, respect in the industry. Does it make you happy? His face hardened. Happiness doesn't pay the bills, Sarah. I thought you were smarter than this. But that was just it. She'd been smart her whole life. Smart about choosing the right college, the right career, the right husband. Smart about investments and networking and climbing ladders. And where had all that smartness led her? To this moment, sitting across from a man who measured his worth in dollars and thought she should too. That evening, David came home from Seattle. He kissed her hello, asked about her days off, mentioned he was worried about her. Sarah wanted to tell him everything, but looking at him, still handsome at 49, successful, comfortable in his life, she didn't know how to begin. They had dinner together, the conversation flowing along familiar grooves. His trip, her work, the kids, plans for the holidays. She watched him cut his steak precisely, the same way he'd done for 20 years. and wondered when she'd stopped finding his habits endearing and started finding them suffocating. "I'm thinking of taking a trip," she said suddenly. He looked up. "Great. Where should we go? Maybe somewhere warm for New Year's?" "No, I mean alone. I booked a flight to Santa Fe." The confusion on his face was almost comical. "Alone? Why? Is this about your birthday? We could do a spa weekend instead." "It's not about my birthday, David. I need some time to think." "Think about what?" Now he looked concerned. "Sarah, what's going on? Are you having an affair?" The question was so absurd she almost laughed. An affair would be simpler, more understandable in their social circle. How could she explain that she was having an existential crisis? That she felt like she was disappearing, one obligation at a time? "No, I'm not having an affair. She searched for words he might understand. "I'm just tired, really tired, and I need a few days to myself." He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was familiar, comfortable, and completely without spark. When had they stopped being lovers and become roommates? "Is this about menopause? Linda's wife went through a rough patch last year. There are treatments." "It's not menopause," Sarah interrupted, pulling her hand away. "Jesus, David, not everything is a problem to be fixed. Maybe I just need to figure out who I am when I'm not being someone's wife or mother or employee." The hurt in his eyes made her feel guilty, but also angry. Why was her need for self-discovery seen as a betrayal? Why was a man's midlife crisis accepted, even expected, but a woman's was pathologized? They went to bed in silence, lying side by side like parallel lines that would never intersect. Sarah stared at the ceiling, counting the hours until her flight. 5 days. She just needed 5 days to remember who she was, or maybe to finally become who she was meant to be. The next morning, Thursday, she went through her usual routine. Shower, coffee, emails. But everything felt different, charged with the electricity of impending change. She found herself really looking at things. The way the morning light hit the kitchen table, the sound of David's electric toothbrush, the feeling of her work clothes against her skin. At the office, she gave Jennifer instructions for her absence, claiming a family emergency. Another lie, but what was the truth? That she was having a spiritual emergency? That she was drowning in plain sight? During her lunch break, she did something impulsive. She walked into a hair salon and asked them to cut 6 inches off her hair. The stylist, a young woman with purple highlights, asked if she was sure. "I've never been more sure of anything," Sarah said. As the scissors snipped away years of careful maintenance, Sarah felt lighter with each cut. Her hair had been the same style for 15 years. Professional, conservative, appropriate. The woman looking back at her in the mirror seemed younger, more alive. "Going through a breakup?" the stylist asked sympathetically. "Something like that," Sarah replied. That afternoon, she sat through her last meeting before the trip, a budget review that seemed to go on forever. She watched her colleagues argue about numbers and projections and thought about how none of it mattered. In 50 years, would anyone remember their Q4 earnings? Would any of this make a difference? Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, just wanted to say thanks for what you said to Ashley. She called me. We talked for like an hour about stuff. Real stuff. It was cool." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile in days. Maybe that's all any of them needed. Permission to be real, to admit they didn't have it all figured out. Maybe her falling apart was actually the first step to putting her family back together in a more authentic way. That evening was book club at Linda's. Sarah had already said she wasn't going, but as 7 o'clock approached, she found herself thinking about all the Thursday nights she'd spent in Linda's living room, drinking wine and pretending to be happy. On impulse, she decided to go one last time. The usual suspects were there: Linda, Carol, Patrice, Mary, and Susan. They exclaimed over her hair, asked if everything was all right. Sarah poured herself a large glass of wine and decided to tell the truth. "Actually, no, everything's not all right. I'm having what you'd probably call a midlife crisis. I'm flying to Santa Fe tomorrow to spend 5 days alone, because I can't remember who I am anymore. I hate my job. I feel disconnected from my husband, and I'm worried I've screwed up my kids by teaching them that achievement matters more than authenticity. Oh, and I haven't actually read any of the books we've discussed in the last 2 years because they all seem pointless. I used to love reading, really love it, but somewhere along the way, even that became just another thing to check off the list. So no, everything's not all right. But I'm hoping it will be. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Carol set down her wine glass and said, "Thank God someone finally said it." And like a dam breaking, they all started talking, really talking, about their fears and disappointments and the ways they felt trapped. Mary confessed she'd been thinking about leaving her husband for years, but didn't know how to start over at 52. Susan admitted she hated being a stay-at-home mom, but felt guilty saying it out loud. Patrice talked about the antidepressants she'd been hiding from her family. They talked until midnight, long past their usual ending time. It wasn't a book club anymore. It was a support group for women who'd lost themselves. As Sarah left, Linda hugged her tight and whispered, "Whatever you find in Santa Fe, bring some back for the rest of us." Driving home through their knees, through the quiet suburban streets, Sarah felt like she'd already begun her journey. The simple act of truth-telling had cracked something open, not just in her, but in all of them. Maybe that's how change really happened, one honest conversation at a time. That night, she packed carefully, comfortable clothes, her new art supplies, journal, books. She felt like she was packing for a new life, not just a trip. David watched from the doorway, still not understanding but trying to be supportive. "I'll miss you," he said. "I'll miss you too," she replied, surprised to find it was true. She would miss him, or at least the idea of him, the life they'd built together. But missing something wasn't the same as needing it. "When you come back, we should talk," he said. "Really talk. Maybe see a counselor." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure there would be anything to save. How do you resurrect a relationship when one person has fundamentally changed? But that was a problem for after Santa Fe. For now, she just needed to leave. The next morning, David drove her to the airport. They kissed goodbye at the curb, a dutiful peck that felt like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. As she walked through the sliding doors, Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't afford to, not when moving forward required all her courage. At the gate, waiting for her flight, she people-watched. Business travelers typing furiously on laptops, families corralling children, couples sharing earbuds. Everyone going somewhere, but how many were running toward something versus running away? Was there even a difference? She thought about texting Ashley and Michael, letting them know about the trip, but something held her back. This needed to be just hers, at least for now. They'd survived her absence their whole lives. Soccer tournaments missed for work trips, school plays she'd watched through the screen of her phone while responding to emails. 5 days of intentional absence might be the most present she'd been in years. When they called her boarding group, Sarah stood on shaky legs. This was it, the moment of crossing over. She could still turn back, make an excuse, return to her life. But as she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, she felt the decision settle into her bones. She was going. On the plane, she had a window seat. As they took off, Minneapolis falling away below, Sarah pressed her face to the glass like a child. The suburbs spread out in neat grids, each house a tiny box containing its own dramas and dreams. From up here, her problems seemed both smaller and more universal. How many women in those houses were feeling what she felt? How many were too scared to do what she was doing? The flight attendant offered her a drink. "Wine? Beer? Coffee?" "Coffee," Sarah said. "Black." She wanted to be fully awake for whatever came next. As they flew south, the landscape changed. The neat order of the Midwest gave way to the rugged beauty of the Southwest. Mountains and desert and vast empty spaces that seemed to promise transformation. Sarah had read that the light in New Mexico was different, that artists came from around the world to capture it. She wondered if it could illuminate the parts of herself she'd lost in the shadows. She'd brought a book to read, one she'd actually chosen, not one assigned by the book club, but found herself unable to focus on the words. Instead, she stared out the window and let her mind wander. Who would she be in Santa Fe? Without the labels of wife, mother, executive, what remained? The question should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like freedom. By the time they began their descent into Albuquerque, Sarah felt like she'd already traveled farther than the miles between Minnesota and New Mexico. She'd traveled away from the woman who'd boarded the plane and towards someone she didn't yet know but was eager to meet. The rental car was a small sedan, nothing like the SUV she drove at home. As she navigated out of the airport, following signs for Santa Fe, Sarah rolled down the windows despite the December chill. The air smelled different here, sage and dust and possibility. The drive north was stunning. The landscape was alien compared to Minnesota, all red rocks and endless sky. Sarah found herself pulling over multiple times just to look, to breathe, to convince herself this was real. She took photos, not for social media but for herself, wanting to remember this feeling of expansion. The bed and breakfast was outside the city, a converted hacienda with adobe walls and carved wooden doors. The owner, a woman named Rosa, who looked to be in her 60s, greeted her warmly. "First time in Santa Fe?" Rosa asked, helping with her bag. "First time anywhere alone," Sarah admitted. Rosa smiled knowingly. "Then you've come to the right place. The desert has a way of showing you who you really are. It strips away everything that's not essential." Sarah's room was simple but beautiful. White walls, colorful woven blankets, a small fireplace. French doors opened onto a private patio with views of the mountains. It was perfect, a blank canvas for whatever she was becoming. She unpacked slowly, placing her journal on the bedside table, her art supplies on the desk. It felt ceremonial, like she was creating sacred space. When everything was in its place, she sat on the bed and finally let herself feel the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd actually left. The tears that came were different from the ones she'd shed in her closet that morning, that now seemed like a lifetime ago. These were tears of relief, of recognition. She was still in there, the woman she'd been before life had worn her down. She just needed to excavate her. That first evening, Sarah walked into town as the sun set, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and rose. The streets were narrow and winding, nothing like the planned suburbs she was used to. She passed art galleries and jewelry shops, restaurants with twinkling lights and the smell of green chile. She ate dinner alone at a small restaurant, sitting at the bar because it felt less conspicuous than a table for one. The bartender, a weathered man who introduced himself as Jim, asked where she was from. "Minneapolis," she said, then amended, "But I'm not sure I'm from anywhere right now." He nodded like that made perfect sense. Santa Fe's full of people who are between lives. Some are running from something, some toward something. Most don't know the difference until they've been here a while. "Which were you?" Sarah asked, emboldened by wine and distance from her regular life. "Both," Jim said. "Came here 20 years ago after a divorce. Thought I was running away. Turns out I was running toward myself. Just took me a while to figure that out." Sarah thought about that as she walked back to the B&B under a sky blazing with stars. In Minneapolis, you could barely see them through the light pollution. But here, the universe announced itself boldly, reminding her how small her problems were in the cosmic scheme of things. That night, she sat on her patio wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars and writing in her journal. "Day 1 in Santa Fe," she wrote. "I feel like I'm in a foreign country, not just a different state. Everything is unfamiliar. The landscape, the air, the person I'm becoming. It's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I keep waiting to panic, to book a flight home. But instead, I feel oddly calm, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be for the first time in years." She thought about David, probably eating takeout and watching TV alone. About Ashley, studying in the library. About Michael, maybe at a party with his fraternity brothers. Her old life continuing without her. The thought should have made her sad, but instead, it made her realize how unnecessary she'd made herself in her own life, always managing and orchestrating rather than actually living. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn. Something she never did at home. The desert silence was profound. No traffic, no suburban lawnmowers, just the occasional call of an unknown bird. She made coffee in the small pot in her room and took it out to the patio to watch the sunrise. The sky lightened gradually, revealing the landscape in layers. First the mountains, purple shadows against indigo sky. Then the closer hills, dotted with pinon and juniper. Finally, the immediate surroundings, the garden with its drought-resistant plants, the walking paths that led into the desert. After breakfast, homemade by Rosa and served in a sunny dining room where guests actually talked to each other, Sarah drove to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. She'd written about the artist in college, but had never seen her work in person. Standing in front of the massive flower paintings, the desert landscapes, the bones transformed into art, Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. O'Keeffe had been in her 50s when she'd moved to New Mexico permanently, leaving behind her life in New York. She'd painted what she saw, but also what she felt, the essence of things rather than their surface appearance. That's what Sarah wanted, to see past the surface of her own life, to whatever essence remained. She spent hours in the museum, sitting on benches in front of paintings, reading every placard. Other visitors moved around her, but Sarah felt invisible in the best way, just another seeker in a city full of them. She bought a postcard in the gift shop, one of O'Keeffe's door paintings, a portal from one space to another. It felt like a metaphor she was living. That afternoon, she drove out to the places O'Keeffe had painted. Ghost Ranch, with its dramatic cliffs, the road to Abiquiu, winding through landscapes that looked like they belonged on another planet. Sarah stopped frequently, sometimes to sketch, though her drawings were amateur at best. It didn't matter. The act of looking, really looking, was what counted. At one pull-off, she encountered another woman, perhaps in her 60s, painting at an easel. They nodded to each other, the acknowledgement of fellow travelers. Sarah watched her work for a while, the confident strokes, the way she translated the vast landscape onto a small canvas. "First time painting here?" the woman asked without looking up. "First time painting in 20 years, Sarah admitted. "It comes back," the woman said. "Like riding a bike. The desert's patient. It'll wait for you to remember." Sarah set up her small watercolor kit on a flat rock, feeling self-conscious but determined. Her first attempts were disasters, muddy colors, uncertain lines. But gradually, something shifted. She stopped trying to paint what she saw and started painting what she felt. The loneliness of a twisted juniper, the hope in a streak of light across a cliff face. They painted in companionable silence until the light began to change. As they packed up, the woman handed Sarah a card. "I teach workshops here, if you're interested. Nothing formal, just women making art and finding themselves." Sarah took the card, Marie Sandoval, artist and guide, and tucked it carefully in her pocket. "I'm only here for 5 days. Sometimes that's all it takes," Marie said. That evening, Sarah ate at a different restaurant, this time requesting a table for one without apology. She brought her journal, writing between courses, not caring if other diners thought she was odd. She was beginning to understand that visibility wasn't the same as being seen, that you could be surrounded by people and still be profoundly alone, or completely by yourself and feel connected to everything. She wrote about the paintings she'd attempted, the conversations with strangers, the way the light here really was different, clearer, more honest. She wrote about David and the kids, trying to understand when love had become obligation, when family had become performance. Her phone buzzed with texts. David checking in, Ashley complaining about her roommate, Linda asking for photos. Sarah read them but didn't respond. Not yet. She needed this boundary, this space between who she'd been and who she was becoming. On the third day, she took Marie up on her workshop offer. There were 4 other women, ranging in age from 30 to 70. They met in Marie's studio, a converted barn with huge windows overlooking the desert. Marie didn't teach technique so much as permission to make bad art, to express without judgment, to take up space on the canvas and in the world. "Most women come here thinking they can't paint," Marie said as they set up. "But that's not really why they're here. They're here because they've forgotten they're allowed to create their own lives." They painted all morning, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories. There was Helen from Michigan, going through a divorce at 65. Priya from California, taking a sabbatical from her tech job to figure out what she actually wanted. Jane from Texas, whose kids had just left for college and who didn't know who she was without them. And Claire from New York, who'd sold her apartment and was traveling until she found somewhere that felt like home. Sarah found herself telling them about the morning in her closet, the emptiness that had driven her here. They listened without judgment, nodding in recognition. It was like book club the other night, but deeper, these strangers understanding her in ways her oldest friends hadn't. I used to be someone, Sarah said, surprising herself with the words. I mean, I'm still someone, obviously, but I used to be someone who believed in things, who had dreams that weren't about mortgage payments and college funds. I don't know when I stopped being her. Maybe you didn't stop, Claire suggested. Maybe she just went underground, waiting for it to be safe to come out again. They painted until the light faded, then shared wine and continued talking. Sarah looked at her day's work, abstract landscapes that bore little resemblance to reality, but somehow captured how the desert made her feel. Expansive, raw, possible. That night, she finally called David. He sounded relieved to hear from her, then frustrated when she couldn't explain what she was doing. You're taking an art class? Sarah, you could do that here. There's that studio in Adina. It's not about the art, David. How could she explain? It's about remembering who I am when nobody's watching. When I'm not performing Sarah the wife, or Sarah the executive, or Sarah the mom. I don't understand. I've never asked you to perform anything. And that was the problem, Sarah realized. He hadn't asked because he'd never noticed she was performing. To him, the performance was who she really was. The efficient woman who managed their lives, who never complained, who kept all the balls in the air. He'd fallen in love with her mask and never thought to peek behind it. I know, she said softly. That's why I needed to leave. To figure out who I am versus who I've been pretending to be. There was a long silence. Then David said, Should I be worried? About us? Sarah looked out at the stars, brilliant in the clear desert air. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe this is the only way to save us. For me to save myself first. After they hung up, she sat in the darkness for a long time. The old Sarah would have reassured him, would have prioritized his feelings over her own truth. But this emerging version of herself could hold space for his worry without taking responsibility for it. The fourth day dawned cloudy, unusual for the desert. Sarah decided to spend it in town, wandering the galleries and shops she'd only glimpsed. In a used bookstore, she found a collection of Mary Oliver poetry, the pages worn soft by other hands. She bought it immediately, remembering how poetry had once been her religion. She sat in a cafe, reading Oliver's words about paying attention, about being astonished, about telling about it. Wasn't that what she was doing here? Finally paying attention to her own life? The poems made her cry right there in public, and she didn't care who saw. In the afternoon, she visited the Cathedral Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. Sarah wasn't religious, hadn't been inside a church in years except for weddings and funerals. But something drew her in. The quiet, the candles, the sense of accumulated prayers. She sat in a back pew, watching people come and go. Tourists taking photos, locals lighting candles. An old woman praying the rosary with practiced fingers. Sarah found herself thinking about faith, not in God necessarily, but in the possibility of transformation, of redemption, of starting over. She thought about her grandmother Rose, who'd attended Mass every Sunday despite her husband's abandonment, despite the church's judgment of divorce. I don't go for them, Rose had said. I go for me, to remember I'm more than my circumstances. Sarah lit a candle, not sure who or what it was for. Maybe for the woman she'd been. Maybe for the woman she was becoming. Maybe for all the women who were stuck where she'd been, afraid to light their own way out. That evening, she attended a winter solstice celebration at someone's home, invited by one of the women from Marie's workshop. The house was full of strangers who welcomed her like family. They shared food and stories, then went outside to build a bonfire. Write down what you want to release, the host instructed, passing around small papers. What no longer serves you. Give it to the fire. Sarah stared at the blank paper, overwhelmed by choices. What didn't she want to release? But finally, she wrote one word. Performance. She watched it burn, the smoke carrying 20 years of pretense into the star-filled sky. Now write what you want to call in, the host said, passing around more papers. What you're ready to receive. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. Truth, she wrote. My own truth. As that paper burned, she felt something shift. Not dramatically, but definitely. Like tectonic plates adjusting deep underground, preparing for eventual earthquakes. On the last day, Sarah woke knowing she wasn't ready to leave. She called the airline, changed her flight, extended her stay at the B&B. Rosa smiled knowingly when she asked about availability. The desert's not done with you yet, Rosa said. It knows how long people need. Trust it. Sarah called Richard, told him she was extending her family emergency. He wasn't happy, made veiled threats about her position. The old Sarah would have panicked, would have apologized and rushed home. But this Sarah simply said she understood and would be in touch when she returned. She spent the day at Bandelier National Monument, hiking among ancient cliff dwellings. The ancestral Puebloans had lived here for centuries, carving homes into the rock, creating community in this harsh landscape. Sarah climbed ladders into the caves, running her hands over walls worn smooth by other hands centuries before. In one dwelling, she found herself alone. The silence was profound, broken only by wind through the canyon. She thought about the women who'd lived here, grinding corn, raising children, creating art on pottery and baskets. Their lives had been harder than hers in every material way, yet she envied their clarity of purpose, their connection to the land and each other. She thought about her own ancestors, immigrants who'd come to America seeking better lives. Her great-grandmother Anna, who'd worked in factories to put her children through school. Her grandmother Rose, who'd raised 6 kids alone. Her mother Eleanor, who'd given up her dreams to support her father's career. A long line of women who'd sacrificed, who'd made themselves smaller so others could grow. But what if the greatest gift she could give her own daughter wasn't sacrifice, but an example of a woman living fully? What if breaking the pattern was the most loving thing she could do? That evening, she called Ashley. Her daughter sounded stressed, overwhelmed by finals. Sarah listened, resisting the urge to offer solutions. Mom, where are you? Dad said New Mexico? What are you doing there? Remembering who I am, Sarah said simply. There was a pause. Then Ashley said, I didn't know you'd forgotten. The honesty of it took Sarah's breath away. Neither did I, honey. Not until recently. Is this about menopause? Jenna's mom went kinda crazy during menopause. Sarah laughed, really laughed. No, sweetie, this is about something else. About realizing I've been living someone else's version of my life instead of my own. Whose version? I don't know. Everyone's. Society's. My mother's. Maybe even yours and Dad's. I've been so focused on being what everyone needed me to be that I forgot to ask what I needed. Ashley was quiet for a moment. Is that why you asked if I really wanted to be a doctor? Yes. I've been thinking about that a lot. I don't know if I do. I mean, I think I do, but I also think maybe I just don't want to disappoint you and Dad. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of unintended expectations. Oh, honey. The only way you could disappoint me is by living a life that doesn't feel true to you. It took me 25 years to figure that out. Please don't wait that long. They talked for an hour, the longest real conversation they'd had in years. About dreams and fears and the pressure to be perfect. Ashley admitted she sometimes wrote poetry, that she'd been thinking about taking a gap year to figure things out. Sarah found herself encouraging it, meaning it. After they hung up, Sarah sat on her patio watching the sunset paint the mountains. She'd been in Santa Fe almost a week now, and she felt like a different person. Or maybe the same person she'd always been, just excavated from layers of accumulated expectations. She thought about going home, what that would mean. She couldn't go back to her old life unchanged, but she also couldn't simply abandon everything. She had responsibilities, relationships, a history that mattered. The question was how to integrate who she was becoming with who she'd been. That night, she wrote David a long email, not about their marriage or their future, but about who she'd been when they met. The young woman with big dreams and bigger heart, the woman who'd believed they could have an extraordinary life together, not just a successful one. "I don't blame you," she wrote. "We both got caught up in the current of what we thought life should be. But I'm drowning, David, and I need to find shore, even if that means swimming away from the life we built." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then turned off her phone. Tomorrow, she'd deal with the response. Tonight, she just wanted to be present with herself, this woman she was still getting to know. The next morning, Marie called. She was leading a group out to paint sunrise at Ghost Ranch. Did Sarah want to join? Sarah said yes immediately, not caring that it meant waking at 4 a.m. They drove out in darkness, a caravan of women seeking light. As they set up their easels, the eastern sky began to glow. Sarah had seen many sunrises, usually through kitchen windows while making coffee. But this was different. This was intentional, devotional almost. As the dawn crested the horizon, setting the cliffs on fire, Sarah began to paint. Not the landscape exactly, but the feeling of it. The way the light seemed to come from inside the rocks, the way the shadows held both mystery and promise. "You're different than when you first came," Marie observed, watching her work. "I feel different, like I'm finally becoming myself instead of performing myself." Marie nodded. "The desert does that, strips away pretense. Some people can't handle it, run back to their comfortable lies. But others, like you, they let it transform them." Sarah thought about that word, transform. It implied not just change, but fundamental alteration. Butterfly from caterpillar. Was that what was happening to her? As they packed up, one of the other women, a regular in Marie's workshops, asked Sarah what she did for work. "I'm a marketing director," Sarah said automatically, then paused. "Actually, I don't know if I am anymore. I might be becoming something else." "Like what?" Sarah considered. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe a writer again. Maybe an artist. Maybe just a woman who tells the truth." That afternoon, she finally turned her phone back on. Multiple messages from David, ranging from hurt to angry to worried. Texts from both kids. Emails from work, increasingly urgent. The weight of her old life crashed back, and for a moment, Sarah felt the familiar anxiety, the pull to fix and manage and smooth over. But then she looked out at the desert, vast and patient, and remembered she had a choice. She could respond from fear or from truth. She could go back to performing or continue becoming. She called David first. He answered immediately. "Sarah, thank God. I've been worried sick. Your email. Are you leaving me?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm not leaving you for someone else, if that's what you're asking, but I might be leaving the life we've built, and I don't know if our marriage can survive that. I don't understand what's happening. Was I that bad a husband?" Sarah thought about how to answer. "No, you weren't bad. You were exactly who you've always been. The problem is I haven't been who I really am. I've been playing a role for so long I forgot it was a performance. So what do you want? Therapy? A vacation? A new job? I want to stop living by other people's definitions of success. I want to write again, make art again. I want conversations that go deeper than scheduling. I want to feel alive, not just productive. You can do all that here. We can make changes." "Can we, though? Can you honestly see me painting in the dining room? Writing poetry instead of performance reviews? Can you see yourself with a wife who might make less money but be more herself?" The silence stretched between them, answer enough. "I'm staying another week," Sarah said. "When I come back, we need to talk, really talk. Maybe with a counselor, maybe not. But I can't pretend anymore, David. I won't." After they hung up, Sarah felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter for having spoken her truth, heavier for knowing the cost. But wasn't that what real life was? Complex, messy, without easy answers? She spent the next days establishing a routine that felt nothing like her life in Minneapolis. Morning pages in her journal, long walks in the desert, afternoon painting sessions, evenings reading poetry, or talking with the interesting people who seemed to populate Santa Fe, artists and healers and seekers of all kinds. She also started writing again. Not the novel she'd abandoned, but essays about her experience, about the moment in the closet when she'd broken open. about the women in book club who'd been silently drowning, about the weight of other people's dreams. One piece, about the performance of modern womanhood, felt particularly alive. She sent it to Emma in Portugal, who responded with enthusiasm and a suggestion: submit it to publications, start a blog, share your truth. The idea terrified Sarah, going public with her private revolution, but she was learning to lean into terror, to see it as a signpost pointing toward growth. On her 10th day in Santa Fe, she got an unexpected call from Michael. "Mom? Ashley told me what's going on. Are you okay?" Sarah smiled at the concern in his voice. "I'm more okay than I've been in years, honey. She said you're like finding yourself or something? Is this why you seemed weird at Thanksgiving?" Sarah thought back to Thanksgiving, just weeks ago, but feeling like another lifetime. How she'd gone through all the motions, the perfect turkey, the Pinterest-worthy table settings, while feeling completely disconnected from it all. Probably yes. "Michael, can I ask you something? Are you happy? Really happy, not just going through the motions?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, I guess. I mean, college is fun and everything, but sometimes I feel like I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. Like I'm following some script." Sarah's heart ached for him, for all of them caught in scripts they hadn't written. "There's no script, sweetie. Or if there is, you're allowed to rewrite it. That's what I'm learning." "Is that why you're in the desert? To rewrite your script?" "Something like that." "That's actually kind of cool, Mom. Weird, but cool." After they hung up, Sarah realized both her children were more capable of understanding her journey than her husband was. Maybe because they were still close enough to their own becoming to remember that identity wasn't fixed, that you could choose who to be. That evening, she attended a poetry reading at a local bookstore. The featured poet was a woman in her 60s who'd left academia to live in a converted school bus and write about the intersection of landscape and identity. Her words were fierce and tender, uncompromising in their honesty. During the Q&A, someone asked the poet about sacrificing security for art. The poet laughed. "Security is an illusion," she said. "I had tenure, a retirement plan, a mortgage, all the supposed markers of security, but I was dying inside. Now I have uncertainty, yes, but I also have aliveness. I'll take aliveness over security in any day." Sarah bought the woman's book, got it signed. As the poet handed it back, she looked at Sarah intently. "You're in the middle of it, aren't you? The Great Becoming?" Sarah nodded, surprised to feel tears threatening. "Good," the poet said. "Stay in it as long as you need. The world needs women who've claimed their own lives." Walking back to the B&B under a canopy of stars, Sarah felt the truth of those words. The world did need women who'd claimed their own lives. Not perfect women, or selfless women, or endlessly accommodating women, but real women living their own truths. She thought about her daughter, stressed about becoming a doctor she wasn't sure she wanted to be, about her book club friends, medicating themselves through lives that didn't fit, about all the women she knew who'd made themselves smaller to make others comfortable. What if her journey wasn't just personal but political? What if every woman who chose authenticity over performance created permission for others to do the same? That night, she started the blog Emma had suggested. She called it Midlife Becoming and wrote her first post about the morning in the closet. It took her hours to get the words right, to balance honesty with compassion for everyone involved in her life. She hit publish at midnight, sending her truth into the digital void. Then she shut her laptop and went outside to sit under the stars. Whatever happened next, she'd done it. She'd told the truth. She'd claimed her story. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By morning, her post had been shared dozens of times. Comments poured in from women who saw themselves in her words. "Thank you for writing what I've been feeling. I thought I was the only one. This gives me courage to examine my own life." Sarah read them over breakfast, tears streaming down her face. Rosa, bringing fresh coffee, patted her shoulder. "You struck a nerve," Rosa said, reading over her shoulder. "Good. Too many women suffer in silence. You're giving them permission to speak." That day, Sarah couldn't paint. The weight of connection, of shared experience, was too heavy. Instead, she walked deep into the desert, following trails she'd learned over her 2 weeks here. She needed the silence, the space, the reminder that she was just one small part of something vast, at a spot she'd come to think of as hers, a flat rock overlooking a valley dotted with piñon. She sat and meditated. Not formally, she'd never learned how, but just sitting and breathing and being. The desert had taught her this too, that sometimes the most important action was stillness. Her phone, deliberately left behind, couldn't interrupt this communion. But she knew what waited. More comments on her blog, emails from work threatening her position, messages from David wanting to know when she was coming home. The real world pressing in. But sitting on that rock, watching shadows move across the landscape as the sun traced its arc, Sarah understood something fundamental. The real world wasn't just the one she'd left in Minneapolis. This was real too. The desert, the silence, the woman she was becoming, maybe more real than the performance she'd called life. A raven landed near her, cocking its head as if asking a question. Sarah laughed, remembering a Mary Oliver poem about ravens and instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. She was trying to do all three. As the sun began its descent, Sarah made a decision. She would go home. She had to eventually, but not to resume her old life. She would go home to dismantle what no longer served and build something new from whatever remained. It wouldn't be easy. David might not understand. Her job would likely disappear. Friends might judge her selfish or crazy. But the alternative, returning to the performance, the emptiness, the slow suffocation, was no longer possible. The woman who could do that had burned up in the solstice fire. That evening, she called Richard and resigned. He was furious, threatened to sue her for breach of contract, told her she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Maybe, Sarah said calmly, but it's my mistake to make. You'll regret this. The economy's uncertain. You'll never find another position at your level. I'm not looking for another position at my level. I'm looking for a life at my level. After she hung up, Sarah felt the peculiar weightlessness of burned bridges. No going back now. The safety net of her 6-figure salary was gone. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt free. She spent her last days in Santa Fe tying up loose threads. Another workshop with Marie, where she created her boldest paintings yet. Coffee with the women she'd met, exchanging contact information, and promises to stay in touch. Long talks with Rosa about the courage to start over. I did it at 58, Rosa told her. Left a 30-year marriage and a house in Dallas to run this place. Best decision I ever made. Not easy, but best. Do you ever regret it? Only that I waited so long. We get one life, Sarah. One. How many years do we waste living someone else's version of it? Sarah updated her blog, writing about the decision to resign, about choosing uncertainty over unhappiness. The response was even bigger than before. Women sharing their own stories of breaking free, of choosing themselves, of midlife becoming. But there were other comments too. Accusations of privilege. Not everyone could afford to quit their job and find themselves in Santa Fe. Judgments about abandoning her family responsibilities. Questions about what kind of example she was setting for her children. Sarah read them all, feeling the sting of truth in some. Yes, she had privilege, savings, education, options. But did that mean she should stay in a life that was killing her slowly? And what example was she setting by choosing authenticity over performance? She wrote another post addressing the criticism, acknowledging her privilege while maintaining that every woman deserved to live authentically, regardless of circumstances, that maybe the details differed, but the fundamental right to selfhood remained. On her last night, she joined the Solstice group again for their monthly gathering. This time, instead of releasing and calling in, they shared stories of transformation. Sarah told hers, the corporate executive who'd remembered she was an artist, the wife who'd stopped performing happiness, the mother who'd learned that modeling authenticity was the greatest gift she could give her children. Others shared their stories too. The lawyer who'd become a meditation teacher, the surgeon who now made jewelry, the teacher who'd left everything to travel the world. All women who'd reached a point where the cost of conformity exceeded the price of freedom. As the fire burned down to embers, someone started singing. Others joined in, songs Sarah didn't know but could feel in her bones. Songs of becoming, of courage, of women claiming their power. She swayed with the music, feeling held by this circle of strangers who understood her better than people she'd known for decades. The next morning, packing to leave, Sarah felt the bittersweetness of ending and beginning. She wasn't the same woman who'd arrived 2.5 weeks ago. That woman, anxious, empty, performing life rather than living it, felt like a ghost of herself. Rosa drove her to the airport, sensing Sarah needed the transition time. They talked about what came next, the uncertainty of it all. The thing about transformation, Rosa said, is you can't know what's on the other side until you get there. You just have to trust that it's better than where you've been. At the departure gate, Sarah looked back at the mountains one last time. She'd come here following Georgia O'Keeffe's footsteps, searching for something she couldn't name. She was leaving with more questions than answers, but they were better questions. Instead of, how can I keep all the balls in the air? She was asking, which balls are actually mine to carry? On the plane, she wrote in her journal, trying to capture everything before the real world diluted it. The quality of light, the taste of transformation, the feeling of being held by the desert's vast indifference that was somehow more loving than any human comfort. But mostly she wrote about the woman she was becoming. Still uncertain in outline, but vivid in essence. A woman who chose truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, aliveness over security, a woman who might make mistakes but would make them as herself, not as a character in someone else's script. As the plane descended into Minneapolis, the landscape white with December snow, Sarah felt the first flutter of fear. It was one thing to be transformed in the desert's crucible. It was another to maintain that transformation in the face of familiar patterns and expectations. But then she remembered the raven, the women around the fire, Rosa's parting words. You carry the desert with you now. When you need strength, remember you've already done the hardest part. You've chosen yourself. David was waiting at baggage claim, looking older somehow, or maybe she was just seeing him clearly. He hugged her carefully, like she might break or bolt. You look different, he said. I am different. In the car, they drove in silence for a while. The suburbs rolled by, identical under their blanket of snow. Sarah watched it all like a movie she'd seen before, knowing the plot but no longer invested in the outcome. I read your blog, David said finally. Linda sent it to me. Sarah waited. I don't understand it. Any of it. You had everything. We had everything. We had everything except authenticity, David. Everything except real connection. Everything except joy. I thought you were happy. I thought I was too, but I was just well-trained. There's a difference. They pulled into their driveway, the house lit up with automatic timers, looking exactly as it had when she left. But Sarah saw it differently now, not as accomplishment, but as architecture of a life that no longer fit. Inside, Oliver the cat greeted her with indifference. The mail was stacked neatly on the counter, everything in its place except her. Are you leaving me? David asked again, more directly this time. Sarah considered. I'm leaving who I've been. Whether our marriage can accommodate who I'm becoming, I don't know. Are you willing to find out? That night, sleeping in her own bed for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the strangeness of the familiar, the expensive mattress that had never quite helped her sleep, the Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like performance fabric, the man beside her, breathing steadily, who felt like a stranger she'd been married to for 20 years. She got up and padded to the guest room, not ready to pretend normalcy. From the window, she could see the same moon that had lit her desert nights. It reminded her she was still the woman who'd painted sunrises and burned old scripts. Minneapolis couldn't change that unless she let it. The next days were a delicate negotiation with reality. David went to work, came home, tried to engage her in normal conversation. But normal was exactly what Sarah couldn't do anymore. When he talked about vacation plans, she talked about selling the house. When he mentioned the country club's New Year's party, she said she'd rather spend it writing. You're scaring me, he said one evening over dinner she'd barely touched. It's like you've become a different person. Not become, Sarah corrected. Remembered. This is who I was before I started pretending. The question is whether you can love her as much as you loved the performance. Ashley came home from Northwestern for winter break, watching her parents' strange dance with worried eyes. But when Sarah showed her the paintings from Santa Fe, something shifted. Mom, these are really good. Like, really good. Why did you stop doing this? Because I thought other things were more important. I was wrong. They spent an afternoon painting together, something they'd never done. Ashley was naturally talented, her medical precision translating into delicate watercolor work. But more than that, she was present, not checking her phone or worrying about grades. I've been thinking about what you said, Ashley confessed, about living my truth. I don't think medical school is it. I think I want to study literature, maybe writing. The old Sarah would have panicked, thought about future earnings and job security. This Sarah just hugged her daughter. Then study literature, write, create. The world needs your truth more than it needs another reluctant doctor. Michael called from Colorado, full of stories about ski trips and parties. But underneath the bravado, Sarah heard something else. Mom, that blog thing you're writing? My girlfriend's mom reads it. She said it's changing her life. That's pretty cool. What do you think about it? Honestly, it's weird seeing your mom be like a real person with feelings and stuff, but also kind of awesome. Like, you're finally interesting. Sarah laughed, really laughed. Thanks, I think. Are you and Dad gonna get divorced? I don't know, honey. We're trying to figure out if there's a marriage left once we stop pretending everything's perfect. Good. The pretending was exhausting to watch. Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah thought. She set up a studio in the basement, clearing out years of accumulated junk to make space for easels and canvases. David watched her transformation of the space with bewilderment. You're really doing this? Giving up your career to paint? I'm giving up a job that was killing me slowly to do work that makes me feel alive. And I'll still earn money, just differently. She'd started getting offers, freelance writing gigs, requests for coaching from women who'd read her blog, interest from a publisher about turning her posts into a book. Nothing close to her corporate salary, but enough. More importantly, work that felt aligned with who she was becoming. The book club women came over one evening, ostensibly to welcome her back, but really to gawk at her transformation. Sarah served tea instead of wine, noticed how that changed the conversation's tenor. So you just quit? Carol asked. What about insurance? Retirement? I'll figure it out. What's the point of retiring comfortably if you're miserable until then? They peppered her with questions, mixing admiration with fear. Sarah recognized their hunger for permission, for possibility, for someone to go first and report back that there was life beyond the suburbs' safe boundaries. I'm starting therapy, Patrice announced suddenly. Real therapy, not just medication management. I want to understand why I need 3 antidepressants to get through my supposedly perfect life. I'm leaving my husband, Mary added quietly. Filed papers yesterday. 30 years of pretending is enough. One by one, they shared small rebellions, tiny steps toward authenticity. Sarah felt the ripple effects of her choice, how one woman's courage could spark another's. Christmas approached with all its mandatory cheer. Sarah refused to do cards, the annual performance of family perfection. She bought simple gifts, meaningful rather than impressive. She told David she wouldn't be hosting his family's elaborate dinner. But we always— Exactly. We always. I'm interested in what happens when we don't always. They had a quiet Christmas, just the 4 of them. Sarah made soup instead of turkey, wore jeans instead of the dress David's mother had given her. They actually talked about Ashley's writing dreams, Michael's uncertainty about his major, the strange new territory they were all navigating. David gave her jewelry, expensive and wrong. Sarah gave him a book about midlife marriage transitions. They looked at their gifts and each other, the chasm between them widening. I don't know how to do this, David admitted later, after the kids had gone to bed. I don't know how to be married to someone I don't recognize. Then maybe we start over, Sarah suggested. Date each other as the people we actually are, not who we've been pretending to be. Or maybe we admit that we've grown in different directions and love each other enough to let go. Is that what you want? To let go? Sarah considered. I want us both to be authentic. If we can do that together, wonderful. If we can only do it apart, that's okay too. But I can't go back to pretending, David. I won't. That night, she updated her blog, wrote about the challenge of integration, how transformation wasn't a one-time event, but a daily choice, how the real work began when you brought your new self back to your old life. The comments section exploded. Women sharing their own integration struggles, their partner's resistance, their fear of losing everything, but also victories. Conversations finally had, changes finally made, truths finally spoken. One comment stopped her cold. From her mother. Sarah, I've been reading your blog. I had no idea you were so unhappy. I wish you'd told me. I wish I'd been brave enough to show you it was okay to want more. I'm proud of you for doing what I couldn't. Love, Mom. Sarah stared at the screen, then called her mother immediately. Mom? You read my blog? Linda sent it to me. I've read every post. Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. For what? For modeling martyrdom instead of authenticity. For teaching you that a woman's worth came from what she sacrificed rather than who she was. I see myself in your posts, the life I didn't have the courage to claim. They talked for 2 hours, the most honest conversation they'd ever had. About dreams deferred, choices made from fear, the different cages each generation built for themselves. By the end, both were crying. It's not too late for you either, Mom, Sarah said. 72 isn't dead. What would you do if you gave yourself permission? I don't know. Travel, maybe? Take that art history class I've always wanted. Stop pretending I enjoy those terrible luncheons at the club. Then do it. Let's both do it. Let's stop performing life and start living it. After they hung up, Sarah felt something shift. The isolation of transformation dissolved into connection. She wasn't alone in this becoming. Women everywhere were waking up, at 30 and 50 and 70, realizing they'd been sleeping through their own lives. New Year's Eve arrived with its promise of fresh starts. David wanted to go to the country club party. Sarah wanted to spend it writing. They compromised. He went to the party, she stayed home with her journal, and Oliver the cat. At midnight, alone by choice rather than circumstance, Sarah raised a cup of tea to herself. To the woman who'd broken in her closet. To the woman who'd found herself in the desert. To the woman still becoming, one choice at a time. Her phone buzzed with texts. Ashley and Michael, sending love and encouragement. Emma from Portugal, inviting her to visit. Marie from Santa Fe, sharing photos from a sunrise painting session. The book club women, each on their own journeys now. And David from the party. I miss who we used to be, but I'm trying to see who you are now. Can we talk tomorrow? Sarah smiled, feeling possibility crack open like dawn. Maybe they'd make it, maybe they wouldn't. But at least they'd try with truth instead of pretense. She opened her laptop, began writing the blog post that would become the first chapter of her book. A year ago, I stood in my walk-in closet, surrounded by everything I was supposed to want, and felt emptier than I'd ever been. I was successful, married, accomplished, and dying inside. This is the story of how I stopped performing my life and started living it. It's the story of choosing uncertainty over unhappiness, authenticity over approval, becoming over belonging. It's one woman's midlife transformation, but it's also every woman's possibility. Because we all have a choice. We can keep pretending, or we can start becoming. The question is, are you brave enough to begin? Outside, fireworks lit the winter sky, celebrating endings and beginnings. Sarah watched them through the window, then returned to her writing. She had a story to tell, a truth to share, a life to claim. Word by word, choice by choice, she was becoming herself. And that, she understood now, was the greatest revolution of all. The world needed women who'd claimed their lives, who'd stopped asking permission to exist fully. Women who painted sunrises and told truth and chose aliveness over security. Sarah Mitchell, 47 years old, was finally one of them, and she was just getting started.